If you asked Arthur Vance, the breakdown of society didn't happen with a war or a plague. It happened the Tuesday morning a raccoon threw a 10mm socket wrench at his head. Arthur was kneeling under the chassis of his 1967 Mustang, a car that hadn't run since the Bush administration, swearing at a rusted bolt that refused to budge. He was tired, his knees ached, and the silence of his empty garage was usually enough to drown out his own thoughts. He reached blindly to his left, groping for the socket he had set down 3 seconds ago. His hand met only concrete. "Blast it," Arthur grumbled, sliding out from under the car on his creeper. "Senile old bat. Losing your marbles." He looked left. No wrench. He looked right. Nothing. Then, he heard a distinct metallic clink from above. Arthur looked up. Perched on the highest shelf, sitting between a can of dried-up paint and a box of spark plugs, was a raccoon. But not just any raccoon. This creature was slumped casually, one leg dangling over the edge, holding the 10mm socket in its paw like a ham sandwich. It stared down at Arthur with eyes that didn't show fear, but rather deep, profound disappointment. "Hey!" Arthur shouted, scrambling to his feet. "Drop that, you masked bandit!" The raccoon chittered, a sound that was suspiciously close to a scoff, and tossed the socket. It didn't just drop it, it aimed. The metal tool bounced off Arthur's forehead with a hollow thunk. "Ow!" Arthur rubbed his head, staring at the creature in disbelief. The raccoon leaned forward, let out a long, scratchy sigh that sounded exactly like Arthur's late wife whenever he tracked mud into the house, and pointed a claw at the wrench on the floor. Then it chattered a series of sharp, rhythmic squeaks that translated, quite clearly, to, "Stop whining and turn the bolt the other way, you idiot." That was the moment Arthur Vance realized his quiet. The silence in Arthur's house was heavy. It was the kind of silence that had mass, pressing against the windows and settling into the dust on the mantel. Since Eleanor passed 3 years ago, Arthur had methodically shut down the machinery of his life. He stopped going to the town council meetings. He stopped fishing at the creek. He stopped fixing clocks, a hobby that had once earned him the nickname the timekeeper of Miller's Creek. Now, at 72, Arthur existed in a grayscale loop of coffee, crossword puzzles, and staring at the half-finished Mustang in the garage, a project he and his son, David, were supposed to finish. But David lived in London now, chasing a finance career, and the car was just a 2-ton paperweight of regrets. It was late November when the storm hit. It wasn't just rain, it was a deluge that turned the sky bruise-purple and lashed against the siding like a whip. The wind howled through the valley, shaking the old timbers of Arthur's Victorian farmhouse. Arthur sat in his armchair, a book unread in his lap, listening to the gale. Around 11 p.m., a tremendous crash echoed from the backyard. It sounded like the world ending, or at least the tool shed collapsing. "Great," Arthur muttered, grabbing his heavy flashlight and a raincoat. "Just let the wind take it. Take the whole house." But duty, a habit harder to break than smoking, forced him out. He stepped onto the back porch, the rain stinging his face. The beam of his flashlight cut through the deluge, landing on the old oak tree near the garage. A massive limb had snapped, crushing the roof of the small lean-to where he kept his firewood and compost bins. Arthur waded through the mud, intending only to assess the damage and retreat. But as he approached the wreckage, he heard it. It wasn't a whimper. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a furious, muffled screaming. CHRR squeak. GRRR click click. It sounded like a chainsaw fighting a garbage disposal. Arthur moved a splintered plank of wood aside. Buried beneath a pile of wet compost and shattered shingles was a raccoon. It was pinned by a heavy beam across its lower back, trapped in the mud. Most animals, in this situation, would be terrified. They would freeze or thrash in panic. This raccoon, however, was currently biting the wooden beam, pausing only to look up at the rain and hiss as if filing a formal complaint with the weather department. When the flashlight beam hit its face, the raccoon stopped chewing. It looked at the light, then at Arthur. It didn't cower. It narrowed its eyes, whiskers twitching, and let out a sharp, guttural bark. "Well, are you going to stand there or get the jack?" Arthur blinked, wiping rain from his eyes. "Hold on, little guy. Don't bite me." The raccoon snorted. It actually snorted. Arthur wedged his boots into the mud and grabbed the end of the beam. He heaved, his old back protesting, muscle screaming. The beam moved an inch. The raccoon took this opportunity to wiggle, but it was still stuck. It looked at Arthur and chattered an impatient, rapid-fire sequence of sounds. "I'm trying," Arthur yelled over the wind, feeling ridiculous for arguing with a woodland creature. "You're fat. You've been eating my compost." The raccoon looked affronted. It slapped the mud with both paws and let out a scandalized shriek. With one final, lung-burning heave, Arthur lifted the timber just enough. The raccoon scrambled free, dragging its back legs slightly, injured but mobile. Instead of running into the woods, the creature limped 3 feet away, shook itself dry, spraying Arthur with mud, and then sat down. It looked at the collapsed shed. It looked at Arthur. Then, it looked at the open back door of the warm, dry house. "No," Arthur said, pointing a finger. "Absolutely not. Go home." The raccoon tilted its head. It looked at the storm, then back at Arthur with a pitiful, trembling shiver. It let out a sound so pathetic, so heartbreakingly sad, a soft, warbling coo, that it would have made a stone statue weep. Arthur groaned. One night. The garage. That's it. He didn't know it then, but he had just invited a dictator into his home. The next morning, the garage smelled like wet fur and old gasoline. Arthur walked in with a bowl of water and a slice of bread, fully expecting the creature to be dead or gone. Instead, he found the raccoon sitting on his workbench. It had somehow climbed up despite the limp. It was currently holding Arthur's favorite screwdriver, inspecting the tip with the scrutiny of a master craftsman. "That's a Phillips head," Arthur said, setting the bowl down. "Put it down." The raccoon looked at him. It had a distinctive mask, dark and jagged, like a bandit from a silent movie. One ear was notched, giving it a rugged appearance. It dropped the screwdriver, which clattered loudly, and stared at the bread. It sniffed the bread. It poked the bread. Then, it looked at Arthur and made a gagging noise. "Is this a joke?" the look said. "It's whole wheat," Arthur defended himself. "It's good for you." The raccoon, let's call him the apprentice for now, pushed the bread off the table. It landed on the dirty floor. He then stared at Arthur and tapped his claws on the workbench. Tap, tap, tap. "I don't have cat food," Arthur sighed, rubbing his temples. "I have leftover meatloaf." At the word meatloaf, the raccoon's ears perked up. He made a chirping sound that sounded suspiciously like approval. Arthur watched as the animal ate. Up close, he could see the injury better. The creature's back leg was swollen, and he moved stiffly. He needed rest. Arthur, being a man who fixed things, felt a familiar tug in his chest. A broken clock. A stalled engine. A crushed raccoon. It was a problem to be solved. "You can stay until the leg works," Arthur told him. "But you stay in the garage. No house." The raccoon finished the meatloaf, licked his paws with fastidious grace, and then limped over to a pile of old rags Arthur used for oil changes. He began to drag them, one by one, into the corner behind the air compressor. "Hey, those are dirty," Arthur protested. The raccoon ignored him, arranging the rags into a circular nest. He fluffed them, turned 3 times, and collapsed with a dramatic huff of exhaustion. He cracked one eye open, looked at Arthur, and let out a low growl. "Turn off the light on your way out." Arthur flicked the switch, standing in the darkness for a moment. "You're a rude guest," he whispered. A chittering sound came from the corner. "And you're a terrible host." The invasion began slowly. It started with tools moving. Arthur would set down a wrench, turn to grab a bolt, and the wrench would be gone. He would find it 10 minutes later, hidden inside a tire or balanced precariously on top of the drill press. Arthur assumed the raccoon, who he had started calling Barnaby because he looked like a Barnaby, was just playing. But as the days turned into weeks, and Barnaby's leg healed into a strut, Arthur noticed a pattern. Barnaby wasn't hiding the tools randomly. He was organizing them. Arthur was working on the carburetor of the Mustang one afternoon. He was struggling to adjust the idle screw. The engine was sputtering, coughing black smoke. "Rich," Arthur muttered. "Running too rich." He reached for a flathead screwdriver. Barnaby, who was supervising from the roof of the car, leaned down and batted Arthur's hand away. "Stop it, Barnaby." I need to adjust the mix." Barnaby chattered angrily. He jumped down onto the engine block, which was cold, thankfully, and tapped his paw on the air intake valve. Tap, tap, tap. "No, it's the mix," Arthur argued. Barnaby hissed. He grabbed a small rag and shoved it into the air intake gap. "What are you doing? You'll choke it." Arthur reached to pull the rag out, but paused. He looked at where Barnaby had stuffed the cloth. There was a hairline crack in the vacuum seal. Air was leaking in. It wasn't the mix, it was a vacuum leak. Arthur stared at the raccoon. Barnaby sat back on his haunches, crossed his front paws, and looked at Arthur with smug superiority. "You knew," Arthur whispered. "How did you know?" Barnaby yawned, showing a mouth full of sharp teeth, and scratched his ear. "I have ears, you deaf ape. I could hear the whistle." Arthur fixed the seal. He turned the key. The Mustang roared to life, purring smoother than it had in 10 years. Arthur looked at Barnaby. Barnaby looked at Arthur, then slowly, deliberately, extended a paw and patted Arthur on the shoulder. "Good job, assistant." From that day on, the dynamic shifted. Barnaby wasn't a pet. He was the foreman. The garage became their sanctuary. The winter deepened, snow piling up against the doors, but inside, the heater hummed and the radio played soft jazz. Arthur found himself talking more in those 3 weeks than he had in 3 years. "See this, Barnaby?" Arthur held up a rusted alternator. "They don't make copper windings like this anymore. Now it's all cheap alloy." Barnaby, who was sitting in his custom-made bed, a heated cat carrier Arthur had bought accidentally while grocery shopping, chirped in agreement. He didn't like the new alloys either. They didn't taste as metallic. "Eleanor loved this car," Arthur said softly, his voice catching. He rarely said her name aloud. The air in the garage seemed to still. "We drove it to the coast for our honeymoon. She spilled a milkshake on the passenger seat. I was so mad. She just laughed. Said it gave the car character." Barnaby stopped chewing on a rubber hose. He padded over to Arthur, his claws clicking on the concrete. He didn't jump up or beg for food. He simply leaned his heavy, warm body against Arthur's leg. He let out a low, vibrating purr, a sound that was more of a rumble than a meow. Arthur reached down, burying his grease-stained hand in the raccoon's thick fur. "I miss her, Barney. I miss her so much I forget how to breathe sometimes." Barnaby looked up. His golden eyes were serious. He let out a soft, questioning trill. "She's not in the car, Arthur. She's in the quiet." Arthur wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Yeah, I know." The moment was tender, heavy with shared understanding. Then, Barnaby ruined it by biting Arthur's shoelace and yanking it untied. "Hey!" Arthur laughed, a rusty sound that felt good in his throat. Barnaby scampered away, chattering a laugh of his own, and climbed onto the high shelf. He began knocking empty oil cans off the edge, one by one. Clang, clang, clang. "You're a menace," Arthur shouted, but he was smiling. For the first time in years, the garage didn't feel like a mausoleum. It felt like a workshop. But the peace couldn't last. The outside world had to intrude eventually. It happened on a Tuesday, exactly 1 month after Barnaby's arrival. A sleek black sedan pulled into the driveway. Arthur watched from the garage window as a man in a sharp suit stepped out. It was Mr. Henderson, a real estate developer who had been hounding Arthur to sell his land for a new condominium complex. Arthur stiffened. He wiped his hands on a rag. "Stay here, Barnaby, and be quiet." Barnaby was currently dismantling a toaster Arthur had brought in to fix. He paused, holding a spring in his mouth, and narrowed his eyes at the stranger in the driveway. He didn't like the suit. It looked flammable. Arthur walked out to meet Henderson. "Arthur." "Good to see you," Henderson beamed, his teeth too white against the gray winter landscape. "I trust you've thought about the offer? It's generous. More than this rustic property is worth." "I'm not selling, Henderson," Arthur said, crossing his arms. "I told you. This is my home." "It's a big house for one man," Henderson said, his voice dropping to a fake sympathetic tone. "And the maintenance, the roof, the plumbing. It's too much. Imagine a condo in Florida. No snow. No repairs. Arthur hesitated. Henderson was right, in a way. The house was crumbling. The memories were haunting. Maybe it was time to let go. To just fade away in the sun. Arthur started. Suddenly, a loud screeching noise erupted from the garage. It sounded like metal grinding on metal. Henderson jumped. What on earth is that? I have a project, Arthur stammered. The garage side door flew open. Barnaby waddled out. But he wasn't just walking. He was dragging something. It was a rusted heavy muffler from a 1980 Chevy truck. Barnaby gripped it in his jaws, dragging it across the gravel with a deafening scrape. Henderson's eyes bulged. Is that a raccoon? Barnaby stopped. He dropped the muffler. He stood up on his hind legs, looking like a miniature bear in a burglar mask. He looked at Henderson. He looked at the shiny black sedan. Then, slowly, deliberately, Barnaby picked up a jagged rock from the driveway. Barnaby, no, Arthur warned. Barnaby didn't throw it. He just held it. He walked over to Henderson's car and stood next to the front tire. He tapped the rock against the rim. Clink, clink. He looked up at Henderson, eyes blazing with a clear threat. Make the deal, and I make this tire a memory. Henderson took a step back, pale. That animal, it's menacing me. He's protective, Arthur said, fighting a grin. He's rabid. You can't keep a wild animal, Arthur. It's against code. If you don't sell, I might have to make a call to animal control. For your own safety, of course. The threat hung in the cold air. Animal control meant cages. It meant euthanasia. Arthur looked at Barnaby. The raccoon was standing his ground, defending a pile of junk and a sad old man against the encroaching world. Barnaby wasn't just a pest. He was a partner. Something in Arthur's chest, a gear that had been seized up for 3 years, suddenly broke free and started spinning. Get off my property, Arthur said quietly. Excuse me. I said get out. Arthur stepped forward, standing next to Barnaby. And if you call animal control, tell them to bring a tank. Because neither of us is going quietly. Barnaby hissed, dropping the rock and raising his paws like a boxer. Henderson scrambled into his car. You're crazy, Vance. You're a crazy old hermit. He peeled out of the driveway, gravel spraying. Arthur stood there, heart pounding. He looked down. Barnaby looked up, chattered a soft sound, and then reached out to tug on Arthur's pant leg. He's gone. Now, about that toaster. I need thumbs. Arthur chuckled, shaking his head. You're trouble, Barnaby. You're nothing but trouble. Arthur looked back at the house. He looked at the garage. He wasn't going to Florida. He had a Mustang to finish, and apparently he had a foreman who demanded high standards. But as they walked back into the garage, neither of them noticed the dark clouds gathering again. Nor did they know that Barnaby's little display of aggression hadn't gone unnoticed by the neighbors. The town of Miller's Creek loved a little drama, but they feared what they didn't understand. And nobody understood a raccoon with a mechanical engineering degree. The battle for the garage had just begun. And Barnaby, he was just getting warmed up. War comes to everyone eventually. For the Greeks, it came in wooden horses. For the French, it came through the Ardennes. For Arthur Vance, it came in the form of a clipboard-wielding bureaucrat named Officer Miller and a drone that sounded like an angry hornet. It had been 3 days since the confrontation with Mr. Henderson. Arthur assumed the real estate developer would retreat to his glass tower to lick his wounds. He was wrong. Henderson hadn't retreated. He had reloaded. Arthur was in the kitchen, attempting to make oatmeal. Barnaby sat on top of the refrigerator, a vantage point he had claimed as his command tower. The raccoon was currently dropping individual pieces of dry kibble onto Arthur's head, testing gravity and Arthur's patience in equal measure. Plink. Cut it out, Arthur grumbled, stirring the pot. Plink. Barnaby chattered, a sound that sounded like a zipper being pulled up and down quickly. Your reaction time is slowing. You'll never survive the winter. I'll survive you, you masked menace, Arthur retorted. Just then, the phone rang. Not the cell phone Arthur kept in a drawer and forgot to charge, but the old rotary landline on the wall. It shrilled with a violence that made both man and raccoon jump. Arthur answered. "Vance residence." "Dad." Arthur froze. The voice was tinny, distorted by distance and ocean cables. "David." "Yeah, Dad. It's me." There was a pause, heavy with the awkwardness of two men who loved each other but had nothing to talk about since the funeral. "Listen, I got a weird email." "From a Mr. Henderson?" "He says, Dad, he says you're having a mental breakdown. He says you're hoarding wild animals and threatening neighbors with rocks." Arthur's grip on the receiver tightened. "Henderson is a shark in a cheap suit, David. He wants the land." I know, David sighed. "But he sent photos. Dad, there's a raccoon on the roof of the Mustang. It looks like it's holding a wrench." Arthur looked up at the refrigerator. Barnaby had stopped dropping kibble. He was leaning forward, ears swiveling toward the phone, listening intently. "He's not hoarding animals," Arthur said, his voice firm. "He's staff." "Staff." David's voice pitched up. "Dad, are you okay?" "Really? I'm fine." "Better than fine. Look, David, I have to go. The oatmeal is burning." "Dad, wait." Arthur hung up. He stared at the phone for a moment, chest aching. Then he looked at Barnaby. "They think I'm crazy, Barney." Barnaby climbed down from the fridge, landing with a heavy thump. He waddled over to Arthur, stood on his hind legs, and patted Arthur's knee. Then he looked at the burning oatmeal, sniffed the air, and gagged loudly. "Crazy, maybe. But a terrible cook? Definitely." The truck arrived at noon. It was white, emblazoned with the county seal and the words Animal Control and Code Enforcement. Arthur watched from the porch. He had spent the morning preparing. Or rather, Barnaby had spent the morning preparing. The raccoon had sensed the shift in Arthur's mood, the tension, the fear, and had gone into full defensive mode. A young officer stepped out of the truck. He looked barely 20, with a uniform that was too big and a hat that sat too low. He checked his clipboard, adjusted his glasses, and walked up the driveway. "Mr. Vance," the officer called out. "I'm Officer Miller. We received a complaint about a potentially rabid and aggressive wildlife infestation." Arthur leaned against the porch column, crossing his arms. "No infestation here, son. Just me." "Sir, the report states you have a raccoon living in your garage. That it, quote, brandished a weapon." Officer Miller looked up, skeptical. "Raccoons carry rabies, distemper, and roundworm. It's a code violation to harbor one." "He's not harbored," Arthur said calmly. "He's free to leave. He just prefers the amenities." "I need to inspect the premises, sir." Arthur sighed. "Go ahead. Garage is round back." Officer Miller nodded officiously and marched toward the garage. Arthur followed, suppressing a smile. He knew what was waiting inside. The officer stepped into the garage. It was spotless. Tools were hung in size order. The floor was swept. The Mustang sat under a tarp. There was no sign of a raccoon. No nest of oily rags. No half-eaten meatloaf. "See," Arthur said. "Clean as a whistle." Officer Miller frowned. He shone his flashlight into the corners. "I smell musk." "That's just owed to old man," Arthur deadpanned. Miller walked over to the workbench. He picked up a socket wrench. The report said the animal was using tools. "That's ridiculous," Arthur said. "Raccoons don't have opposable thumbs." "Well, not really." Miller put the wrench down. He leaned over to look under the Mustang. At that exact moment, a drop of oil fell from the rafters. Splat! Right on the officer's hat. Miller stood up, wiping his hat. "What the—" Another drop. Splat! Miller looked up. High above, perched on the rafters in the shadows, was Barnaby. But he wasn't just sitting there. He was wearing, Arthur had to bite his cheek to keep from laughing, a pair of Arthur's old welding goggles around his neck. And he was holding an oil can. Barnaby tilted the can. A third drop fell. Officer Miller shrieked, stumbling back. "There. It's up there. Oh, that, Arthur said casually. That's just the foreman. He's checking for leaks in the roof. It's wearing goggles, Miller yelled, pointing a shaking finger. That's not natural, Barnaby chattered, a low, menacing sound that echoed in the rafters. He then dropped the oil can. It didn't hit the officer. It landed precisely in a metal bucket on the floor with a loud clang, startling Miller so badly he tripped over the creeper and fell onto a pile of tires. Barnaby descended. He didn't scamper. He climbed down the support beam with slow, deliberate movements. He stopped on the workbench, eye level with the terrified officer. Barnaby reached into a small cardboard box on the table. He pulled out a business card, one of Arthur's old ones from his clock repair days. He held it out to Miller. Miller stared at the raccoon. The raccoon stared at Miller. "Take it," Arthur whispered. "He's networking." Miller slowly reached out and took the card. Barnaby nodded once, satisfied, then turned around, bent over, and sprayed a cloud of dust in Miller's face with his back paws before vanishing under the cabinets. Miller scrambled up, red-faced and covered in dust. This is a citation. I'm writing you up. Harboring a dangerous animal. I'll be back with a trap, Mr. Vance. A big one." He ran to his truck. As he peeled away, Arthur watched a lug nut roll across the driveway. It had come from Miller's rear tire. Arthur looked down at the garage floor. Barnaby was peeking out from under the cabinet, holding a tire iron. "You loosened his wheel?" Arthur asked, horrified. Barnaby shook his head and tossed the tire iron aside. He made a chuffing sound. "No. I just tightened it until the bolt snapped. He needed new suspension anyway." Arthur sat on a stool and laughed until his ribs hurt. It was a dangerous game they were playing, but for the first time in years, Arthur felt like he was winning. The Mustang. The victory with Officer Miller was short-lived. The letter came the next day. A formal notice from the county. Condemnation warning. The house was deemed structurally unsound based on an external audit provided by Henderson surveyors. They were hitting him from all sides. Arthur sat in the garage that night, the letter crumpled in his fist. The Mustang sat before him, the hood open. The engine was mostly assembled, but the electrical system was a nightmare of frayed wires and missing diagrams. "I can't do it, Barney," Arthur whispered. The silence of the garage felt heavy again. David was right. I'm just an old man fighting a tide I can't stop. Barnaby was sleeping in his carrier, but at the sound of Arthur's voice, he woke up. He padded over, his claws clicking softly. He jumped onto the fender of the Mustang and looked into the engine bay. He looked at the distributor cap. He looked at the spark plug wires. Then he looked at Arthur. "You're giving up? Over a piece of paper?" "It's not the paper," Arthur said, tears pricking his eyes. I don't know what I'm doing anymore." Eleanor was the one who handled the fights. She was the fire. I was just the mechanic. Barnaby sat down. He reached out a paw and touched the distributor. He wiggled it. It was loose. Arthur sighed. "I know it's loose. I can't find the clamp. I lost it 3 years ago. The day she died. I was working on the car when the hospital called. I dropped everything. I never found it." Barnaby tilted his head. He stared at Arthur for a long, unblinking moment. Then he turned and scrambled off the car. He ran to the back of the garage, to a pile of junk Arthur hadn't touched in a decade. Old paint cans, broken lawnmower parts. "Barney, come back. It's late." Barnaby ignored him. He began digging, throwing trash behind him like a dog. Clatter. Bang. Crash. "Barnaby!" The raccoon stopped. He emerged from the pile, holding something in his mouth. It was covered in grime and cobwebs. He walked over to Arthur and dropped it in his hand. Arthur wiped the dirt away. It was a small, crescent-shaped metal bracket. The distributor clamp. Arthur stared at it. How did you find this?" Barnaby chattered softly. He rubbed his head against Arthur's hand. "I find things that are lost, Arthur. That's what I do." Arthur fitted the clamp. It snapped into place perfectly. He tightened the bolt. He connected the battery. "Okay," Arthur whispered. "Okay." He reached through the window and turned the key. The engine didn't just start. It sang. A deep, throaty rumble that shook the dust off the shelves. It was the sound of 1967 waking up in 2025. It was the heartbeat of a ghost. Arthur killed the engine, overwhelmed. He looked at Barnaby. The raccoon was standing on the roof of the car, arms raised like a conductor who had just finished a symphony. "We did it," Arthur whispered. Barnaby clapped his paws together. Smack, smack. Then he pointed to the door. "We fixed the car. Now let's fix the developer." The buzzing bird. 2 days later, the buzzing started. It was a Saturday morning. Arthur was drinking coffee on the porch, feeling a newfound resolve. The Mustang ran. That meant he could drive. That meant he wasn't trapped. The sound came from the sky, a high-pitched whine. Arthur looked up. Hovering about 50 feet above his roof was a drone. It was sleek, white, and had a camera lens that looked like a black, unblinking eye. "Henderson," Arthur spat. "Spying now." The drone dipped lower. It hovered near the garage window, peering inside. Barnaby burst out of the cat door Arthur had installed. He saw the drone. His fur puffed up until he looked twice his size. He hissed, a sound like a steam pipe bursting. "Easy, Barney," Arthur said. "It's out of reach." The drone pilot, likely sitting in a van down the road, grew bold. The drone swooped down, buzzing Barnaby, taunting him. It flew circles around the oak tree. Barnaby wasn't having it. To a raccoon, the sky belonged to birds and squirrels. This plastic intruder was an abomination. Barnaby scrambled up the oak tree. He moved with surprising speed for a raccoon who ate mostly meatloaf. He reached the lower branch and waited. The drone hovered closer, the camera zooming in on Arthur. "Go away!" Arthur shouted, waving his cane. The drone ignored him. It drifted toward the tree, trying to get a better angle on the wild animal. That was a mistake. Barnaby didn't just jump. He launched. He was a fuzzy missile of fury. He caught the landing skid of the drone with one paw. The drone's motors whined, struggling against the weight of a 20-pound raccoon. The machine dipped, spinning wildly. "Mayday! Mayday!" The drone seemed to scream. Barnaby didn't let go. He swung his other paw, smacking the plastic propellers. Thwack! The drone spiraled out of control. It crashed into the rhododendron bush with a satisfying crunch. Barnaby tumbled into the grass. He rolled, shook his head, and stood up. He walked over to the twitching, sparking wreckage of the drone. He sniffed it. He decided it was not edible. Then, he did something that made Arthur freeze. Barnaby grabbed the drone by one of its broken arms and dragged it onto the porch. He dropped it at Arthur's feet. Then, he looked at Arthur's toolbox. He picked up a screwdriver. "You want to take it apart?" Arthur asked. Barnaby chirped. "We salvage the parts. I need a new motor for the toaster." Arthur laughed. He sat down on the porch steps, picked up the drone, and handed Barnaby the screwdriver. "All right, Foreman. Let's see what this bird is made of." The discovery. They spent the afternoon dissecting the enemy. Barnaby was surprisingly good at removing small screws. Arthur handled the wiring. When they popped the casing of the drone's camera unit open, a small SD card fell out. Arthur picked it up. Video footage. He went inside and plugged it into his dusty laptop. Barnaby sat on the keyboard, watching the screen. The footage showed the drone taking off from, not Henderson's office, but from the construction site down the road. It showed Henderson standing next to a man in a city inspector's uniform. Arthur turned up the volume. The drone's microphone had picked up their conversation before takeoff. "Just get footage of the rats," Henderson's voice said, tinny but clear. "I paid you $5,000 to condemn the place, Miller. I need visual proof the old man is senile, so the state takes the deed." The inspector, Officer Miller, looked nervous. "He's not senile, Mr. Henderson. He's just eccentric. And that raccoon is scary smart." "I don't care," Henderson snapped. "Fake the report if you have to. I want that land by the 1st of the month. Arthur sat back, the blood draining from his face. Bribery, Arthur whispered. Fraud. Barnaby tapped the screen where Henderson's face was frozen in a sneer. He let out a low growl. We got him. Arthur looked at the raccoon. We have proof. But who will believe us? The crazy old man and his pet raccoon. Barnaby jumped off the desk. He ran to the window and looked toward the garage where the Mustang sat, fully restored and ready for war. He looked back at Arthur, his eyes gleaming with a reckless, wild idea. He chattered a sequence of sounds that Arthur understood perfectly. We don't need them to believe us. We need to show them. We take the evidence. We take the car. We go to the town council meeting tonight. Arthur stood up. He felt a surge of adrenaline he hadn't felt in decades. The fear was gone. In its place was the cold, hard steel of determination. You're right, Arthur said. Put your goggles on, Barnaby. Barnaby grabbed his welding goggles from the hook. Arthur grabbed the SD card and his car keys. We're going to town. The 1967 Mustang didn't just drive, it prowled. It sat idling in the driveway, the cherry-red paint gleaming under the floodlights Arthur had turned on for the occasion. The exhaust note was a deep, rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum that vibrated in Arthur's chest, waking up memories he thought had been buried with Eleanor. Arthur sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wood-grain steering wheel. He wore his Sunday best, a tweed jacket that smelled slightly of mothballs, and a determined scowl. In the passenger seat sat Barnaby. The raccoon was strapped in. Arthur had rigged a seatbelt using a bungee cord and a carabiner, securing the animal safely. Barnaby wore the welding goggles. He sat upright, paws resting on the dashboard, looking like a furry co-pilot ready to break the sound barrier. You ready, Foreman? Arthur asked, revving the engine. Barnaby chattered, a sharp, crisp sound. The oil pressure is optimal. The tires are warm. Punch it, Grandpa. Arthur released the handbrake. Let's go make some noise. He dropped the car into gear and floored it. The tires squealed, kicking up gravel as the Mustang shot out of the driveway and onto the dark country road. They hadn't gone a mile before trouble appeared. Blue and red lights flashed in the rearview mirror. It was the white truck from Animal Control, followed closely by a sheriff's cruiser. Officer Miller had been staking out the house. They're tailing us, Arthur shouted over the roar of the engine. Barnaby twisted around in his seat, adjusting his goggles. He hissed at the flashing lights. He looked at Arthur, then pointed a claw at the gear shift. Downshift. Third gear. Don't let the revs drop. I know how to drive my own car. Arthur yelled back, but he downshifted. The engine roared, and the Mustang surged forward, putting distance between them and the pursuers. Miller's truck was new, but it was heavy. The Mustang was a piece of American muscle designed when gas was 20 cents a gallon and safety regulations were just suggestions. Arthur took the curves of Miller's Creek Road with a precision that surprised even him. He wasn't just driving, he was dancing. Miller must have called the sheriff, Arthur muttered, checking the mirror. They'll try to box us in at the bridge. Barnaby let out a worried squeak. He tapped the dashboard frantically. He pointed to the glove compartment. What? A map. I know the way. Barnaby shook his head. Squeak hiss. He pointed again. Arthur popped the glove box open. Inside was a bag of marbles Arthur used for testing level surfaces on workbenches. Barnaby grabbed the bag. He looked at Arthur. Absolutely not. Arthur shouted. This isn't a cartoon, Barnaby. You are not throwing marbles at a police car. Barnaby looked disappointed. He put the marbles back but pulled out a half-eaten granola bar instead. He took a stress bite and chewed furiously, eyes glued to the side mirror. They reached the bridge. Just as Arthur predicted, a second cruiser was blocking the far end. Hold on, Arthur said, his voice tight. Dad. The voice came from the car's speakers. Arthur had connected his phone to the new Bluetooth radio he'd installed, with Barnaby's supervision, just yesterday. David. Dad, I'm watching the news. There's a high-speed chase in Miller's Creek. Is that the Mustang? I'm kinda busy, son. Arthur swerved to avoid a pothole. Dad, pull over. You're going to get arrested. I'm going to the town hall. Arthur shouted. I have proof. Barnaby, hold on. Arthur didn't stop for the roadblock. He saw a gap, a dirt service road that cut off to the right just before the bridge. It was steep, muddy, and meant for tractors. Arthur yanked the wheel. The Mustang drifted, back end swinging out. Barnaby let out a warrior's cry, "Hurry!" and leaned into the turn like a motorcycle racer. The car hit the dirt. Suspension groaned, mud flew, but they bypassed the blockade, bouncing through a cornfield and launching back onto the pavement on the other side. We made it! Arthur laughed, a manic, joyous sound. Barnaby patted his chest, checking for heart palpitations, then gave Arthur a shaky thumbs up. Miller's Creek Town Hall was a brick building that smelled of floor wax and bureaucracy. Tonight, the main chamber was packed. Mr. Henderson stood at the podium, looking polished and regretful. A large projection screen behind him showed a picture of Arthur's house. "It breaks my heart," Henderson was saying, dabbing his eye with a silk handkerchief. "Mr. Vance is a pillar of this community. But his mind, it's gone. The property is a hazard. Rats, raccoons, unstable structures. For his own safety, and the safety of the neighborhood, the state must intervene. My company is prepared to manage the cleanup." The town council members nodded solemnly. Mayor Higgins leaned into his microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. If there are no objections, we will move to vote on the eminent domain seizure." "I object." The double doors at the back of the hall didn't just open, they were kicked open. Arthur Vance stood there. His hair was windblown, his tweed jacket was rumpled, and he was breathing hard. He looked like a man who had just wrestled a tornado. And perched on his shoulder, wearing welding goggles and looking like a small, furious gargoyle, was Barnaby. The room gasped. A woman in the front row dropped her purse. "Arthur." Mayor Higgins blinked. "And, is that a raccoon?" "This," Arthur announced, walking down the center aisle, his cane clicking rhythmically, "is the foreman. And we have something to show you." Henderson turned pale. "Security! Get this madman out of here. He brought a wild animal into the chamber." Officer Miller, who had just run in through the side door, panting and covered in mud from the chase, lunged for Arthur. "You're under arrest, Vance." Barnaby moved. He didn't attack Miller. He launched himself from Arthur's shoulder, clearing 5 feet of air, and landed on the podium directly in front of the mayor's microphone. Thump. The feedback squealed. The room went dead silent. Barnaby stood on his hind legs. He reached up and adjusted the microphone down to his level. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the mayor. He looked at Henderson. Then, he reached into the little pouch strapped to his bungee cord belt and pulled out the SD card. He slammed it onto the podium. Slap. He chattered loudly, pointing at the AV technician in the corner. "Plug it in, kid. And don't mess up the aspect ratio." "He wants you to play the video," Arthur translated, stepping up beside the raccoon. "This is irregular," Henderson shouted, sweat beading on his forehead. "You can't let a raccoon submit evidence." "It's an open forum, Henderson," Mayor Higgins said, leaning forward, intrigued. "Let's see what the raccoon has to say." The verdict. The video played on the big screen. The room watched in silence as the drone footage rolled. They saw the construction site. They heard Henderson's voice clear as a bell. "I paid you $5,000 to condemn the place. Fake the report. I want that land." They heard Officer Miller's nervous agreement. They heard the plot to frame Arthur. When the video ended, the silence in the room was heavy. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a gavel bang. Mayor Higgins turned to Henderson. "Mr. Henderson, do you have an explanation?" Henderson stammered. It's a deep fake. That raccoon generated it." Barnaby snorted. He leaned into the microphone and let out a long, dry, wheezing sound that sounded exactly like a buzzer on a game show. "ERRRRNT." The crowd erupted in laughter. "I think the evidence speaks for itself," the mayor said, his face hardening. "Sheriff, I believe we have some fraud to discuss." As the sheriff moved toward Henderson, the developer panicked. He bolted for the side exit. "He's running!" someone shouted. Arthur couldn't move fast enough. But the foreman could. Barnaby scrambled off the podium. He didn't run. He scuttled with aerodynamic efficiency. As Henderson passed the first row of seats, Barnaby darted out and grabbed the cuff of his expensive Italian trousers. Henderson tripped. He went down in a heap of limbs and lawsuits. Barnaby sat on Henderson's back, looking triumphantly at the sheriff. He chattered a command. "Cuff him, boys," and read him his rights. "I want this by the book." The aftermath. The drive home was slower. The sheriff had escorted them, not to arrest them, but to shake Arthur's hand and ask for a selfie with the vigilante raccoon. When they pulled into the driveway, the adrenaline finally faded, leaving Arthur exhausted but lighter than he had felt in years. He parked the Mustang in the garage. He unclipped Barnaby's seatbelt. "We did it, partner. House is safe." Barnaby climbed out. He took off the goggles and hung them on the rearview mirror. He looked tired, too. His limp was slightly noticeable again from all the exertion. He walked over to his food bowl. It was empty. He picked it up and dropped it loudly. Clang. I know, Arthur chuckled. "Steak tonight. I'll defrost a ribeye." Barnaby paused. He looked at Arthur. He made a soft, cooing sound. "Medium rare." Arthur went inside to cook. For the first time, he didn't eat standing up over the sink. He set the table. 2 plates. One for him, one on the floor for the foreman. As they ate, the phone rang. It was David. "Dad," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw the news. It's all over the internet. Raccoon exposes corruption." "Dad, you were amazing." "It wasn't me, Dave," Arthur smiled, looking down at Barnaby, who was currently dissecting the ribeye with surgical precision. "I had good help." "I'm coming home," David said. "Next week. I want to help finish the Mustang. And I really need to meet this raccoon." "He's looking forward to it," Arthur said. "But bring gloves. He judges people by their handshake." Epilogue. Spring. Spring came to Miller's Creek in a wash of green and gold. The repairs on the Victorian house were well underway, paid for by the settlement from Henderson's company. Arthur was in the garden, planting tomatoes. He was humming a tune. The garage door was open. Inside, David was under the Mustang, tightening the suspension. "Hey, Dad," David called out. "Where's the 10mm socket?" Arthur stood up, wiping dirt from his knees. "I don't know," asked the boss. High up in the branches of the old oak tree, lying in a custom-built hammock made from a repurposed cargo net, was Barnaby. The raccoon was wearing sunglasses, actual child-sized sunglasses Arthur had found. He was holding a walkie-talkie in one paw. David looked up. "Barnaby, 10mm." Barnaby sighed. He reached into a hollow in the tree and pulled out the socket. He dropped it. It landed perfectly in David's outstretched hand. "Thanks," David laughed. Barnaby chattered into the walkie-talkie. It crackled on Arthur's belt. "Break time is over, Vance. Those tomatoes won't plant themselves. And bring me a grape." Arthur shook his head, smiling at the sun. He grabbed a grape from his pocket and tossed it up. Barnaby caught it mid-air, popped it into his mouth, and gave a satisfied chitter. The house wasn't quiet anymore. It was full of noise, and grease, and life. Arthur Vance wasn't just waiting for the end. He was the owner of the best garage in the county, father to a son who had come home, and the junior partner to a raccoon who had fixed the one thing Arthur couldn't fix himself: his heart.